with you.
And thank you for taking the time to sit down with us and to talk to our audience, Yonkers Voice.
Of course.
Mimi, you're running for Westchester County District Attorney. Important position. You're going to hold a lot of responsibility on your hands. Tell us why you're running.
Absolutely. So I was a federal prosecutor for 16 and a half years here in New York. It's called the Southern District of New York, starting in 2001. And for the last 5.5 years, until 2017, I was chief of what's called the White Plains Division, or the Westchester Office of the Department of Justice. I served there as a chief under Preet Bharara, who is a Westchester resident and was the U.S. Attorney. That was during the Obama administration. And so I had the opportunity to be a leader in law enforcement here in Westchester, working with the District Attorney's Office, working with all the different law enforcement components, government components, social services, and service providers. And I saw what wonderful opportunities there are to do good through law enforcement, which is not something that people often think of, but I think that there really are so many opportunities, especially here in Westchester. And so I want to bring to the DA's office my experience as a prosecutor, but also my determination to make the office more proactive and innovative, working together with the community and doing community outreach and taking the politics out of the DA's. I think that's something very when we look at how much politics can corrupt institutions. And so I hope to earn people's faith back in the justice system. That's one of my main priorities as district attorney in Westchester.
Now, Mimi, for those that are not sure of who should they vote for, you or your opponent, tell us one of the basics difference between both of you that will help me make that decision.
Sure. So I'll give you three, if that's okay. I always do things in threes. One is my experience. I was a prosecutor, as I said, for 16 years. So I know what it's like to talk to a family of a victim of crime. I know what it's like to negotiate a plea agreement. I know what it is that prosecutors do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that would make me a much better leader of that office, because I understand what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And that's an important part of the job. And also because I want to teach those prosecutors that doing the job of a prosecutor means doing justice. It doesn't mean seeking convictions only. It means doing the right thing. My mentor, Preet Bharara, actually has a saying, do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And that's something I want to teach to the prosecutors there. We need to change the whole mindset, really, of a prosecution office. The other big difference, I think, is, in addition to my experience as a prosecutor, is, again, my desire to put integrity and ethics and professionalism first and foremost in the DA's office. I will not be taking campaign contributions from any elected officials. I will not take campaign contributions from police unions, and I will not take campaign contributions from defense attorneys who have cases before me at the DA's office. Why? Because I want to eliminate the potential for any conflicts of interest, and I want people to be able to look at my decisions and know that they're being made for the right reasons, and I'm not having outside influence. This is something that's important in the justice system.
You know, Mimi, sorry to interrupt you for a second, but let me ask you the questions, because otherwise you are answering questions that I had on my script.
Yeah, I was giving you three different reasons, but I'll stop it. I'll save the other one.
But you said something extremely important, and something that it's a concern to people, I guess, not just in Westchester County, but in the entire nation. Prosecutors, at least to us, from this side of the fence, it looks like they are more interested in convictions than actually justice. It looks like they will go the extra mile to get a conviction, and not very concerned that probably the person who they are in court with, that they are trying to convict, is the person who is the victim. Not always because somebody is accused, the person is guilty. But the concern is the way it looks to us is that there is more interest in that conviction than actually finding justice.
Right.
How would you deal with those prosecutors?
So I understand that that's the way it looks. That is not the way I was raised as a prosecutor for 16 years. I just want you to know, not all prosecutors are like that. I truly was taught that doing justice sometimes means pursuing a case aggressively with all the tools available if it's the right case to pursue. But it also can mean backing off of a case, and most importantly, paying attention to when there are signs, what we call red flags, that tell you something isn't right and you need to re-examine your theory of the case. You don't just go full steam ahead no matter what. And I think too many prosecutors are afraid to do that, are afraid to change their theory of the case, are afraid to admit they might have made a mistake. Those are the things that on day one, I will teach the people who work for me. It is okay to come in and say, you know what? I think we've got this wrong. We need to reevaluate. We need to do much more training of prosecutors, implicit and explicit bias training. That is not happening in the DA's office right now in any consistent way. And that would be a major part of what I would do with those district attorneys to help prevent the problem you're talking about. And the last thing I'll mention is the presence of a real conviction integrity unit. This has been a big part of my platform. The current DA did not have a conviction integrity unit until I put forth my plan. And now you can find his so-called proposal for one on his website, but it's really not a comprehensive conviction integrity unit, which is a unit that is designed to hear claims from people who have been convicted and their lawyers and their family members saying that they were wrongly convicted. My plan has been endorsed by an exoneree, Jeff Duskovic, who has his own foundation, who was a Westchester resident who was convicted of a rape and murder and then exonerated by DNA. He became a lawyer and started his own foundation, and he has endorsed me because my plan is a real plan to try and really make sure this doesn't happen, because even one innocent person in jail is too many.
Now, I have a question from one of our members. Why aren't prosecutors held personally accountable when they maliciously prosecute a case that they knew prior hand that was not the way they projected to be?
Well, it's a great question. And the short answer is they should be. If all of those facts that this person who asked the question can be shown, if we know that a prosecutor deliberately went ahead with a case, knowing that they did not have the real perpetrator of a crime, that person should be fired and that person should be held accountable. Now, it's interesting because actually the person I just mentioned, Jeff Duskovic, he's partnered with another organization called It Can Happen to You. And they got legislation signed by not just them alone, but they worked to help get legislation that the governor did sign, creating essentially a commission to oversee prosecutors and hold them accountable in these kind of circumstances. The governor signed it, but then it was actually overturned by a court as not constitutional. So I think you're going to see that legislation again. I think accountability for prosecutors is absolutely necessary. I think ideally we teach and train prosecutors, and if you have the right leader to do that, I think you can change the mindset for a lot of them. But when it happens, we need to hold them accountable.
Now, Mimi, not long ago, Mrs. Scarpino released information records on police officers that had priors. Would you have done the same thing, or do you have a different point of view when it comes to that? So
the DA did eventually release let's call it an adverse credibility list, right? It's supposed to be a list. This is what DAs all over the country, all over the state had already done. This DA was very slow to do it. I absolutely would have done it. A big part of my proposal for reforming the DA's office in Westchester is transparency. And if people go on my website, mimirocha4da.com, I have many different plans listed, and one of them is about unprecedented transparency in the DA's office. It's so important to all the things we're talking about: accountability, earning the trust back of the community. The DA took a long time to release his list. I think In the end, he released it because he was getting pressure from my campaign to release it. Although he claims he did it in the name of transparency, but I'll leave that to others to judge. What is most remarkable about that list, though, that he did release, and this I would not have done it this way. First of all, he has on that list officers listed, law enforcement listed with things that I don't think go to their credibility, frankly, like an old DUI type of, a very old DUI type of offense. That actually is not something that would eliminate someone from being able to testify as a witness. So I'm not sure why he included those. And then the other thing that was striking is that he had someone on that list that he hired in a very leadership position in his office, someone who's the head of what's called the Westchester Intelligence Center. That person who he hired to run it had an adverse credibility finding against him by the FBI many years ago. And while I don't think that that means that person should never work again or that he, you know, anything like that, it really was striking to me that of all the retired FBI agents in the country, that was the one that Mr. Scarpino chose to head up a very prestigious intelligence center. And that it made us wonder, many people wonder, is that why he didn't want to put this list out? Because he didn't want to show that someone he had hired would be on this list. And that goes to this core problem. We do not want leaders right now, any leaders in any government position, making decisions based on their own personal interests. We want them making decisions based on what is best for the community. And, you know, I'm just not sure that happened here, and that's troubling to me.
Now, Mimi, gun sense advocate, what does that mean?
So after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2017, I worked on many types of gun trafficking prosecutions as a prosecutor. But when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was able to do more advocacy type work. And I worked with an organization called Moms Demand Action for Gun Safety, which is an incredible grassroots organization that works to help get legislation passed that is you know, for example, the red flag laws, what we call the red flag laws, emergency order here in New York State, and many other types of legislation. And so I worked closely with Moms Demand Action. I've put forth a 4-point plan for gun safety, again, on my website, MimiRocahForDA.com. And the goal of the plan is really to get more guns off the streets and out of the hands of people who could be violent. And again, my plan and my candidacy has been endorsed both by Fred Gutenberg, who you may have heard of. His daughter was killed in Parkland, and he's become a very outspoken advocate for gun safety, a national advocate. And also by Barry Grobart, who's one of the leaders of Moms Demand Action here in New York State.
Now, Mimi, things have changed. The DA of today is not the same as the DA of 20 years ago. We are in the 21st century. How would you adapt to the current technology? Because crimes now are done differently. What would you do different, or what would you do to adapt to the current era?
Well, it's a great question. And look, again, that's one of the reasons, actually the third reason that I was going to say when you were asking me about why people should vote for me. I want to bring a fresh, new, modern approach to the DA's office. We need to be more proactive and more innovative. Obviously, the job of the district attorney is to keep people safe. And we need to think, though, about what the modern day threats are. So, for example, as a prosecutor, I focused on sex trafficking and crimes against children, online predators. That was a big focus, human trafficking, sex trafficking. I was very involved in creating the Westchester Anti-Trafficking Task Force, which is still in existence. Looking at crimes online, that's where one of the greatest threats to our children is. As a mother and a prosecutor, putting aside the current pandemic, that is what keeps me up at night. If your children use the internet, they're at risk. And those child predators aren't going anywhere. But there are very proven law enforcement techniques and education and outreach that we can use to really help prevent those crimes. And it involves partnerships. It involves being proactive and innovative working with schools, working with law enforcement, working with community outreach groups. And it's a crime that transcends race, gender, and economic class. So this is something that I would bring as a focus to the DA's office. It's an example of modernizing the DA's office. I know that most of the crimes, we really have to step up our capability to look at crimes online, and that's one area in particular.
Now, since we are talking about 21st century crimes, let's talk about the cyberbullying, something that started happening on the 21st century since the internet, bloom, and it's a problem, but it's a problem, but seems like we don't have the mechanism, or at least locally, that mechanism is not used. How would you use it, or what would you do for those that are using technology to bully others? And very often the reaction of those bullying is things that we cannot roll back. Suicide. Taking actions after the suicide for their child or adult, because adults and children, they are both being bullied by cyber. How do you see that issue?
Such an important issue. Look, I think that we have to, first and foremost, as you say, we have to try to prevent that kind of bullying, especially when it comes to the children, right? Because for them, it's the hardest to undo it. So that, again, goes back to what I was just talking about: partnerships, outreach, education. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are organizations out there that are dedicated to this. And so as district attorney, I wouldn't be in the business of creating an anti-bullying program, but I would be in the business of spearheading to make sure that we get that into the schools. It's not in the schools right now on any systematic basis. The other thing is that it's true, the state laws right now are sort of behind the times. They have not caught up with the technology. Now we have to balance free speech, and that's very important. But I would want to take a look at what laws we have on the books and what laws we should be advocating for our legislators to pass. And then the other important piece of this, again, it goes back to partnerships, is working with the FBI and federal authorities, because actually some of the online tools, the tools available for prosecuting people for online activity, is much more comprehensive at the federal level, believe it or not. And so I was involved in many prosecutions at the federal level of what's called sextortion, which is a horrible form of cyberbullying. And again, occurs with minors, but also with adults, where someone essentially entraps someone online to get them to send some kind of, not sexual, but compromising type of information or picture that then the perpetrator can use to say, okay, now if you don't do whatever it is that they want them to do, whether it be a sexual act, meeting them in person, something, paying them money, I'm going to expose this to you. And with minors in particular, that's very powerful because they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their peer groups. So those are cases that actually at the federal level can be prosecuted quite severely. And so at the local level, we need to make sure to partner with the federal authorities to refer those kinds of serious cases to the federal authorities to make sure that examples are set and people understand that there is a consequence, a severe consequence.
Domestic violence. I'm sure that you heard about a case that happened 2 days ago in Mount Vernon. Actually, we covered a man allegedly shot a 12-year-old and the mom. Domestic violence is a serious offense, but domestic violence goes both ways. The woman is not always the victim, and when the man is the victim, law enforcement does not take it as serious because it's the man that it's involved. I'm not implying or saying that's the case all the time, but it happens. At least men feel that it happens. How would you address both? Would the man and woman be seen in the same way when they are victims of domestic violence?
Well, look, I think the law, at least in theory, does treat men and women the same. And of course, domestic violence is one of the worst crimes possible and a very prevalent crime. And you're right, it does occur across genders, and it occurs to people who are in the LGBT community, people who are more afraid of coming out into the open with their complaints. I think, though, that it is a fact, a statistical fact, that domestic violence affects women more than men. And I think, I work, the other thing, kind of advocacy I've been doing for the past couple of years is working with an organization called My Sister's Place, which is one of the leading service providers and advocates for domestic violence and human trafficking, and also with the Pace Women's Justice Center. So this is something I'm very focused on. I think right now, in the time of this coronavirus, when people, I'm lucky enough to be sheltered at home, which is a safe place. But as we know, and as you point out, it is not a safe haven for many people. It is really, this is just a really dangerous time for people who are in situations with someone who has been, or frankly could be, abusive, because the stress of the situation is making it harder, on everyone and people who might be prone to domestic violence. So we need to be specifically attuned to it. And again, we need to think of proactive ways to get out to victims of domestic violence before it happens. We need to consider an online order of protection system right now. There are things that I think the district attorney should be talking about doing that I don't hear him talking about. And we need to work and partner with the advocacy organizations like My Sister's Place. Most importantly, we need to get the guns out of the hands of people who can be violent, because when it's solved, then you really, it's even a whole different.
But before we get to something else, maybe, my question is not about the law. The law might be there, but there is somebody that enforces those laws, okay? And the laws to the community, many don't feel that the laws are enforced equally when the man is the victim. Okay. Changes have been done in regards to women who felt that many years ago they did not have justice. Now it seems like, not that they're not getting justice, but that the system, the legal system, the law enforcers are overseeing certain things that actually show that they are not the victims, and we becoming the victims, and nothing is done about it. At least not much. We are talking about changes, not about the laws. Would you change that, or would you train your personnel to make sure that men and women are seen the same and both can be victims, regardless if women are the majority of the victim? Even if it's one victim, and justice needs to be found.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I think that we need to train police officers. This goes to what I was talking about, the implicit bias training, which has many different areas that it's applicable. And this is one of them. We can't go into law enforcement, whether it's prosecutors, police officers, shouldn't go into a situation presuming they know what happened based on stereotypes. You need to really examine the facts and the evidence, and that's what you're trained to do. And so it means having an open mind, I think, is largely what you're talking about. That yes, there could be situations where the man is the victim of the violence, and we have to examine it objectively and with an open mind.
Mimi, something that everyone is talking about, bail reform. To lots of people, that's a problem. What is your view on that?
Well, look, I think people have very strong feelings about bail reform. Overall, the bail reform that we did get, we needed bail reform, right? The idea that people were in prison simply because, or in jail simply because they...
Mimi, I'm sorry, let me interrupt for 1 second, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Bail reform, the majority of the people understand that in theory, bail reform was necessary. It's not right that a person who stole a loaf of bread but cannot pay $50 for the bail, it's going to say they're waiting for a trial for 6 months. In the meantime, somebody who killed somebody but able to post $1 million bail, it's out in a matter of 2 hours. We know that. Now, what I'm asking is about the consequences and how things are being done now after the bail reform law passed. You know, people are being arrested and being released in an hour just to reoffend again. So the tweaking of that law, should that been done before the law actually passed?
Well, I think there needs to be some changes made to the law, tweaks, as you say, and I think that what we're hearing is that they're going to do that. So first of all, categories of crime that weren't included as bail eligible offenses, which I think need to change. The one that comes to mind is second degree burglary, when people go into a home, but there's no force or violence used. Right now, that category, under the way the law was passed, that people were not eligible for bail. That has to change. If someone goes into your home, they should not be released just with no consequence, in my view. And I think, from what I'm hearing, that is where the legislator is going to go. They're going to amend, for example, that category of crimes. We need to make sure perpetrators of domestic violence are captured. Serial violators of certain kinds of laws. So there are definitely categories that need to be re-examined. Why it was passed the way it was in the first place, I wasn't part of that process, but it's sort of too late to talk about whether it should have happened. But here we are now, and as far as I understand it, they are going to fix certain categories. I personally, as someone who had experience as a prosecutor for 16 years, don't have a lot of faith in bail itself as a preventative measure, either with risk of flight or dangerousness. I would like to see some kind of component for remand based on dangerousness. I understand that can be very problematic, but I've said this before. I think with the right training for judges and the right standards set out, if it was written into the law in certain ways, and if we have transparency in the statistics. So we need to make sure that people, the public, is given the real statistics about who gets arrested, who gets detained, who gets actually prosecuted. And that goes back to my transparency plan. Because anything, as you said, laws are not biased, but the implementation can be. And so we need to put the data out there about who's getting arrested, who's getting bail, who's not getting bail, to see how the implementation is actually being exercised. But we need to make sure the community is safe. I'm the daughter of crime victims. My parents were both the victims of very serious crimes, violent crimes, and so I do look at this from that perspective. And it's it can be sort of re-traumatizing to have a crime committed against you and then know that the person is out there with no consequences.
Mimi, race very often, well, let me change that. People of color very often feel and think that the judicial system is not fair to them, that it's always one-sided. Black commits one crime versus white that commits the same crime, that they are treated differently. I know that circumstances, we have to look at case by case, but the community, the minorities, don't see it that way. They see that as a racial thing. Blacks always get the tougher penalty. Do you see it that way, or how do you see it?
There is no question that there has been racial bias in our criminal justice system. That's just a fact, and anyone who can't, I think, say that out loud is not being realistic and not being honest with themselves and with the community. So again, I hate to keep repeating these words, but if people look at my plan for transparency that I've put forth, which is really, I think, more revolutionary than any other DA, even in the state, it's for this reason. The way to get at trying to solve some of these systematic problems is, of course, training, as I said, implicit, explicit bias training in some real and meaningful way, not, some kind of haphazard now and then obligation that district attorneys and the people who work there and law enforcement have to do, but something that is really meaningful. And secondly, it's about putting the numbers out there for the public to see, so that people can so that we as prosecutors and in law enforcement are held accountable for what you're talking about. We need to see who's getting arrested, who's getting prosecuted, who's not, and what kinds of sentences there are. For too long, we all know, you don't have to be an expert in criminal justice to know that the Harvey Weinsteins of the world the Larry Nassers of the world, they've been getting away with crimes that other people of color absolutely would not get away with for so long. And it's because of the color of their skin and their access to high-priced attorneys and power and money. And we have to change that dynamic. And I believe in holding everybody accountable when it's appropriate, including people like the Harvey Weinsteins of the world. And so that it's two sides of the same dynamic that you're talking about.
Do you think that our judicial system, it's time for an overhaul, for a change, for a look into?
Well, that's a very broad question. I mean, look, I think that there are a lot of, first of all, we're talking about state judges, federal judges. The judicial system is very different depending on even which jurisdiction you're talking about.
We talk about yours.
I think that there needs to be more training of judges. I really am a big believer in training. I think that, we need to do it in a more meaningful way. As district attorney, I would not be in charge of that, but it's something that I would certainly advocate for, especially because we have people who have been judges for a very long time. And as you say, the justice system is changing and it's different. And I think that smart people are capable of, changing their views, but we need to educate them.
Now, I'm reading here and I see that a statement from you, with Trump attacking the rule of law in Washington. Can you tell us something about it? Because I understand Westchester County DA, you would not have much to do with that probably, but people are going to vote for you based on your overall, you as a person, your views, how you see things, how you react to things. So can you give us a little bit more on that? What do you mean by it?
Yeah, well, look, I did spend the past 2 years largely on MSNBC, also on some other networks, speaking out against Trump and Bill Barr, the Attorney General, and all the Attorney Generals before that, and their assault on the rule of law. And what I mean by that is this sort of flagrant lawlessness where they abuse, in my opinion, Trump has been violating the law. Bill Barr has been allowing him to do that and, in fact, protecting him. And of law and norms, I think has got people so frustrated because it goes back to what we were just talking about. People see someone like Donald Trump just almost explicitly obstructing justice, for example, right? Doing it out in the open, and yet he can't be touched. And here we are, where people are in jail, in prison for long periods of time, largely people of color, for things much more minor than that. And that inequity, inequality is just, it's frustrating to people. And so I think part of being in any elected position right now, even at the local level, is one, showing that we are going to try to hold all people accountable. That doesn't, sure, if Donald Trump, he has a golf course here in Westchester, if there's something to hold him accountable for here, I will. But not just that, but showing that we're going to hold all elected officials, all public officials, all people of whatever economic class and background accountable. That is setting the example of accountability that I think needs to be set in this country. And also it means using the platform of the district attorney to stand up and use that voice to speak out about what is right. So I'll give you one concrete example. In December, it was actually the day I announced my candidacy, Bill Barr was quoted as saying that communities had to show more respect to law enforcement or they weren't going to get the protection they needed or wanted. And I was just stunned by that statement. It's such a mafia. I prosecuted the mafia for many years, and it's a very mafia-like statement. And it's just wrong. And if I were district attorney at that time, I would have put out a very public statement pushing back against that. I would have asked my law enforcement partners in Westchester, all the police departments, to join me in that statement. Some would, some wouldn't. It's a symbolic thing, but I think it is something that in today's world with Trump, flagrantly abusing power the way he does, we need to stand up and use our voices to push back against that.
Well, Mimi, we have spoken about the issues that you're running on, modernization of the DA, promotion of social justice, protecting the innocent, and fighting corruption. But there is one that we left out for last, which is the detailed 4-point plan to remove illegal guns from the street. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit about that in connection with my work with Moms Demand Action. So my 4-point plan essentially is, first of all, to work on the effective implementation of what's called the red flag laws. So making sure that people who, men or women, who might be victims of domestic violence know that they can petition to have a gun taken out of the hands of their abuser before it's too late. And right now, basically, we either law enforcement assumes that, well, someone will get an order of protection or they'll come into the DA's office. No, we have to do more outreach. I would make a 1-page sort of cheat sheet that would be given to all the police departments to give out to victims by the police when they go to a domestic violence call, whether or not an arrest is made, whether or not an order of protection is entered. And just in general, because those laws are only as good as the implementation, and if people know about them and their ability to use them to petition to have the gun taken away. And secondly, I would work on educating parents and students about safe storage laws. This is a very important issue right now, again, with more people home. We have these laws on the book, but most people either don't know about them or don't follow them. And most school shootings occur because students get guns that are not safely stored in their own home. That's a statistical fact. And so we need to work on making sure that people who do lawfully own guns, that they are safely stored out of the reach of everyone, except for the intended owner who can get them, but in particular, young people. I would also join the District Attorneys Against Gun Violence Association, which our current district attorney hasn't done, which I find kind of surprising, because of course you want to coordinate with district attorneys from around the country on innovative ideas to help prevent gun violence. And lastly, I would work on programs in different communities like Mount Vernon, like Yonkers, where we work on anti-gang, anti-violence type of programs, making sure that we have alternatives to provide to gang members. I've worked very closely with the Shamoya McKenzie Foundation in Mount Vernon. Shamoya was tragically killed at the age of 13.
Yes, I was there that day as well.
Really? Okay.
Christmas, yeah.
It was a tragic case. I was a federal prosecutor at the time and we ended up charging the case against the people involved in her murder. And I've worked with her mother, Nadine, but it's something that it's a tragedy, obviously, for Nadine, for Shamoya's family and the community, but it's also a tragedy for the people who were involved in the murder, right? All of those young people had been arrested before for much more minor offenses, and we have to work on programs that give them alternatives and try to get them out of that cycle of violence before it gets to the point where they're now arrested for murder and they're going to be in prison, likely for extremely long time. So the idea is to try and work at earlier stages with them to try and get them out of that cycle of violence.
But Mimi, at times they don't stay there in jail for a very, very, very long time, as you said. We had the case with the Mike Nolan. One, I think the driver of the vehicle that was involved in that murder is out already. So it looks like at times the consequences for the crimes like this are not hard enough. Donna will no longer be able to see her son, but one of those that was involved in the taking of his life are already out, go on. So maybe, and I know that you don't pass sentences, you just prosecute, but you are part of our justice system as well.
Absolutely. And look, I've spoken to Jimmy Nolan. He's done amazing work himself, and we've met on several occasions. And we did actually speak right around the time that the driver was getting released. And he was quite upset, not only that he was getting released, and I asked him if it was okay for me to raise this issue, But he was upset because they really didn't feel they were given proper notice. And they were actually quite upset with the district attorney's office because they, as the family, and I understand this again, as the daughter of someone who right now someone is sitting in prison in Chicago for having violently broken into my parents' home, assaulted my dad, assaulted my mother. If that person was going to get out of prison, I would absolutely want to know about it ahead of time. And the fact that that didn't happen here is tragic. Look, as a prosecutor, you have to balance the desires of the family, of the victim's family. This is one of the first things we spoke about today. As a prosecutor, I've done that. I understand what it feels like to talk to victims' families about sentences, about what kind of punishment they want and what's going to realistically happen. And the two are not always the same. We need to, as prosecutors, advocate aggressively on behalf of victims when it's appropriate. We need to make sure the system is fair, as we've been talking about, but that is absolutely part of a prosecutor's job. And I think I bring to this someone who's done that myself many, many times, and it's a balance. But I fighting for victims is a hugely important part of why I became a prosecutor, as I mentioned, and why I want to bring that fight to the job.
And you were a victim yourself, not you personally, but your mom. And I understand that was the propeller that drove you to study law, correct?
That's right. My mother was a victim of a violent rape many years ago in Chicago, and basically, it was in the 1960s, and she was not given any justice. The police at the time didn't do anything. That was sort of the time. And so one of the main reasons I went to law school and decided to become a prosecutor was that I wanted to try and bring justice to victims of all crimes. I think, again, that's something a prosecutor needs victims to know, that they're there, that they're going to fight for them and their families. But we do have to make sure that it is done in a fair way. And that doesn't just mean what I would do. It means making sure the system is as fair as possible. Because as we've been talking about, there is inherent discrimination that happens in the system. So it's not easy, that it's a balancing act, but this is something that I think I bring these different perspectives to the office. As someone who is the daughter of a crime victim, I really have that perspective. I've worked with crime victims, but I'm also what I would call a real progressive prosecutor who wants to make sure that the system is fair and that we're providing as many alternatives as we can to people before we get to the sort of lifelong sentence type crimes.
I'm sure that you make your mommy proud, and that you now seek justice, to give to those that were on your mom's place but got none. So, Mimi, to conclude this interview, we already spoke about why you should be elected, but perhaps you want to take this time to once again emphasize on that so people can make an educated decision. And let me just take this opportunity to make a disclaimer that Yonkers Voice does not endorse or oppose any candidate. We invite anyone to our platform to speak with our audience so they can make an informed decision on who they're going to vote for. Our only interest is to inform they make the last decision. So please take this time to say whatever you think you should say to our audience.
Thank you. Look, as I said, I think I bring experience to this office that isn't there right now. Experience as a federal prosecutor, experience as someone who has lived through with my family horrible crimes, but also a real passion to do justice. It is what I was taught as a prosecutor by wonderful mentors across the years, that it is better to let one innocent person, one guilty person go free than any innocent person to go to prison. And I think that we need to speak out loud about some of the inequities in the system and make sure that we address them. And we need to take a new, fresh, modern approach to what it means to be a prosecutor. And that's something that I think I would really be able to bring to this office in a way that is not currently being done. And I would love to debate the current district attorney on the issues. I think that's what's most important to talk about. I've challenged him to debates. I haven't heard a response one way or the other. As far as I know, he hasn't accepted it. But that is what I am all about. I'm about talking about the issues. I've started doing a series that we're putting out every week of videos where I interview different people on the issues and talk about my plans, because it's really about people understanding what the substance is that we can bring to the office and what differences in leadership we would have. And my leadership is about integrity, ethics, transparency, and justice, and doing justice and teaching that to the prosecutors of the DA's office.
On that note, we conclude this interview. Thank you very much once again for taking the time to speak with us, and we wish you the best of luck, Mimi.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.